friends, and welcome to episode 2 of the Zengem Series. I am pumped for what you guys are about to do today because in the first episode you were practicing taking all of these zentangle designs and learning how to draw them step by step. And that can be really fun and engaging because you're learning something new, you're going through and trying out all of these different drawings. And so this is a great opportunity for you to practice some things that people have laid out step by step to show you. But I think that the best part is when you get to combine all of these different zentangle patterns in a really creative way. And so we're learning how you can take all of those different zentangle patterns and combine them into one design. And so that's what our goal is for today, and we're working our way up to being able to do this step on your own. But I thought it was important to show you an example of how you're going to take all of these different patterns and put them into one drawing. So today we're going to go step by step, and I'm going to show you exactly how to complete this zentangle drawing so that all of these patterns are created, you've got all of your value added, you know how to complete all of the steps. So I'm just going to guide you through this before you're able to do it yourself. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we begin, you need to make sure you've got either a mechanical pencil or a pencil that is super sharp and you've got access to a pencil sharpener that you can continuously use. Working with a very small point is really important for this step because we want to make sure that our lines are very thin and that we can go through and really tighten up some of those spaces. And if we've got a dull pencil, that step can be very difficult. I thought it would be helpful to learn how to draw these zentangle patterns together by looking at a reference photo so that we can see how another artist did it before we try it ourselves. So that's what we're working from, is a drawing that another artist has created. I also added grid lines to help us space these things out accurately so that we can kind of see what the artist was doing and why. So that's why the grid lines are there. So we're going to start by drawing the things that are in front first. So I started by adding that skinny little string-like shape that's going across that bottom right square, and then I added that second part that's going all the way up along the right edge. So I was working to just block out some of these spaces, but it was really tricky not to get caught up in remembering what things looked like. And even with this part right now where I was sketching out these swirly shapes, it was very tricky not to fall into the pattern of drawing from my memory. And as you can see, some of these things didn't look exactly the way that they looked in the picture. And that's perfectly fine. I was just working my hardest to try to match up the spaces and fill this background in the same way. So I was just going through and trying to lay out some of those key markers, like the swirls at the top and those things over the front, to help me just block out where these areas were going to start. Next, I was adding in those square tile scale things that were underneath this space. So I blocked that out and started to add in where that spiral section would be directly above it. So it's really just a matter of paying attention to the reference photo, looking back and forth, and using the grid to make sure that you're putting things in the correct spots. As I was laying out these pencil lines and marking where all of these zentangles would go, I was really relying on the grids to help me figure out where the placement should be. So for example, the intersection of those two lines on that grid, so the very middle of that square, is exactly where that tile starts and splits into a second one. So I sort of used that knowledge to help me space my tiles out a little bit more. I was also able to look and see, okay, where does this hit that line? And I noticed that in the area I'm drawing in right there, it was about halfway up that square edge where that tile intersected the line. So I used that knowledge and the grid lines to help me space these things a little bit more accurately. Something I would like to talk you through is this space right here where I'm adding those two swirls to the left. So I see that they overlap that tile, so I made sure that they were going over the top of that black square that's going to be filled in. And then I drew them going off to the side, but didn't go all the way to the edge because I can see in the reference photo that there's just a little section coming off behind that space, just off to the left. So I made sure to leave room for that. Once I had finished that step, I was completing the tile off to the side of it, so I was paying attention to the fact that that square ends right up against that middle line. So I'm using the grid yet again to make sure that I'm placing these things in the correct locations. Then I added that swirl to the left behind the space that we drew in the same way. Usually I would like for you to draw zentangle patterns in whatever way you would like, but in this case I think it's important for you to stay on the same page as me so that we can complete this drawing together before you're expected to do it on your own. So I would like for you to pause the video here and try it and catch up with these steps, and then I'll show you the remainder of the drawing. Once you're caught up, we're going to start working on the designs in that top left corner. So I'm beginning by adding these circles just directly above the swirl that we added. And I'm just paying attention to how many I'm adding and making sure they're in the correct location. So again, for this, we really want to make sure that we're using our space wisely. So I'm going through and adding these lines and paying attention to the grid lines to make sure it's in the correct location. This little bit that I'm adding right now goes from that left edge and curves all the way around and wraps even behind that piece that we've already added. Comes all the way back around and is sort of like a stem, but then grows out to the side just a little so that it looks like a pea pod almost. So it's like a section that's holding little tiny spheres. My design turned out just a little bit differently than the reference photo, and that's perfectly fine. I realized that I couldn't fit any more of those little muka swirl designs, so I chose not to add them, and that was perfectly fine. No big deal. So we're just trying to make it as close as possible, and if it's not exactly right, that's perfectly fine. This is just a practice. For this next part, I was working on adding in the texture for the feather that's off to the left-hand side. So I drew in that center stem, and then I was adding in each of these little tiny feather designs. So it's just a long, skinny, pointed section that has a line dividing it in between. But I noticed that in the reference photo, some of these were extended and slanted at different angles. So I made sure to pay attention to that and show it as much as I could in my own drawing. So I continued to add the lines, and I was doing this to help create sort of a border before I added what was going to go in the background. Remember that it's easier to add the things that are going to be in the foreground, so what's closest to you, before you add what goes in the background. So that's why I added the side edge of that feather before I started on drawing this background space, so that I could make sure that I wasn't drawing into an area that I shouldn't be. So essentially I'm framing these areas out by adding what goes above it first. From here, I used many sketchy little lines to create all of those different circles for the berry style design. So I used multiple lines, and then I was planning on choosing my best lines after I had drawn them all out. Once I had drawn out the circles, I went through and added these tiny little bases essentially for the stems, and that's where all of those stems will go back and connect. So I went through and kind of smoothed out all of my lines and chose my best ones before I went through and added the stems. I'd like for you to pause the video here and get caught up so that we're on the same step before moving forward. Because we've already drawn in the majority of the foreground designs, we can start working on adding our background designs now. So for this background design, it fills that space pretty well. I think it was a good choice for that artist to fill in this area with this web zentangle. So we're adding these lines and essentially just rounding out any corners that are created. So we've got all of these intersections from our lines, and anytime there's a corner, we just want to make it rounded. So if it's a shorter corner, then you're going to have a really tight curve, and if it's a really kind of wide open type corner, more of an obtuse angle, then you're going to have a really slanted curve. After looking at mine, I realized it wasn't complex enough to match the reference photo, and it was because I was missing this vertical line. So you can go ahead and add that too, and we're just going to round out those corners in the same way. For this next section, I accidentally simplified it while I was creating it for this video, so you're welcome to follow along with the reference photo and try to make it the more complex version, or you can follow along with what I did. But essentially, I just divided this space by making kind of a larger star shape, and my lines were intersecting. And then I added sections continuously on the same side of those lines. So it was sort of like a pinwheel, just going all the way around and adding those lines just continuously on the same side. And that's how you complete this next design. So I would like for you to pause the video at this point and catch up with me in your designs. The first step to finishing those string rope-like things that are in the foreground is to add circles on either side of it, and you want to make sure that they are sort of alternating space-wise. For this design, once we have added those circles, we're going to draw a little ridge that's going over the top of that circle, so an arch, and then sort of a tail that's leading back towards that first one. So it's really important that we're working with pencil during this phase, because you do have to go back and erase one of those little tiny lines. So like you can see right here, I've got to go back and erase that line so that it looks like it's part of that whole piece. We want to have it look like it's connected in that area. You're going to complete this same step on both sides of your string shape, and you're going to go all the way down and erase those little tiny lines in each section when you add a new space in that little arch. You'll complete this same step on both sides of both of those string shapes. Next, we're going to work on that leaf type pattern that's in that top right box. So we're going to begin by drawing a couple of different diagonal lines that are slanted towards the center. We're going to draw those lines, and those are representing the stems in the middle of each of those leaves. So we'll begin by just sketching out that basic shape for our first leaf, and we're going to begin by just curving that line and slanting it back. We'll repeat that step until you've got your two main leaves drawn, and then you should have some that will show just on the bordering edges of that space. Now when you're adding the lines that are leaning back towards the vein for this leaf, it's really important to notice that those lines are not perfectly straight. They're actually slightly curved, and then they slant in towards the middle line or that vein in the middle of the leaf so that it almost becomes part of that line. So they're really creating like nice sharp points up against that center line. To finish this step, you'll just do that exact same thing, but filling in leaves that are essentially on the outside edges of this space. Our next design is in the bottom right corner, and we're going to begin by adding in the solid branches, almost is what I imagine these shapes are, and we're adding that first branch and then wrapping a triangle around it, essentially. So we're going to draw that front part of the triangle that goes over the top of the stem, but we don't have to draw the triangle meeting at that top corner because that center branch is over the top of it. So we don't need to draw what's behind it, we just need to draw what goes in front of it. You're going to continue completing these steps in the exact same way, you're just going to add a couple different branches. The last step to complete in pencil is to go through and add in those separate sections and the texture of the feather off to the left-hand side. The next step is to begin outlining, and in my opinion, I think it's best to start with the fine point Sharpie because you can go through and really select the areas that you want to be solid black. And that's a really important part of going through and filling in a Zentangle, is making sure that you don't just have outlines of things because it looks a little busy and there's not enough space to make other areas stand out. So you really need to go through and figure out which areas you're going to incorporate solid black in. So we filled in the background of the left-hand side. We also need to fill in that top part of each of these boxes that we drew, and we need to make sure that it's nice, solid black boxes. Next, you'll fill in the black circles along the edges of this string shape. Next, I added a black outline up against these triangles just so that I could know I wasn't going into that space too much and just filled it in with black in that surrounding space. Once I had all of those major black areas filled in, I switched to working with my V5 pen. So it's just a matter of going through and outlining all of the pencil lines that you've added. And so this step does take a little bit of time, but I would really recommend not going too fast when you're working on this because we want to make sure that these lines are nice and crisp. And we really want to make sure that we aren't doing that sketchy little mark thing that sometimes students do, where they have multiple lines that join to make one line. In this design, it is so important that we work with nice, smooth edges. So you need to make sure that you're using one solid, fluid motion to outline all of these spaces, rather than trying to go through with those short little lines, because it'll make it look too sketchy. Something that you'll notice when you're working with that fine point Sharpie is that there will be a lot of areas where you won't be able to fill the space in all of the way, or you won't be able to get a nice crisp corner because that pen is too thick to create that small of a corner. So I would recommend in all of the areas where you've added black, especially for example what I'm working on now, I would definitely recommend going back in and sharpening all of those spaces with your V5 pen after you filled it in with your Sharpie, because you'll have to go back through and sharpen up all of those corners and fill in those tiny little spaces that the Sharpie couldn't quite get. I'm going to complete that same step up in the top left corner, and I'm just going around all of these spaces and using my V5 to sharpen up any of those edges that might be a little bumpy and rough. And also I'm using that V5 to fill in some of those smaller details that the Sharpie wasn't able to get to because the tip was too thick. Once you've got all of the corners filled in those black spaces, and you've got all of your edges nice and smooth when you've got black in the background, then it's really just a matter of going through and outlining all of your other lines in your design. I would recommend considering changing the thickness in some of your sections just so that it's not only filled in with solid sections of black or the thickness of your V5 pen. So I would recommend going through and adding a little bit more thickness to some of your lines, but really it's just a matter of outlining at this point. As you're outlining, you'll go through and add 2 lines in these open sections on the bottom of these square scale type shapes. So we're going to divide those open spaces, and we want to make sure that the corners are all in one straight line. Next, I was working on finding little details to fill in, so I added the black background behind these little circles. I added short little lines up against the edges of all of these square tile scale shapes. And I finished outlining all of those tiny little details throughout my sketch so that I can complete this next step of adding a small amount of value using your charcoal pencil. Once you've finished outlining everything, you'll go back and erase your details, and if you start to lose something, that means that you haven't outlined it yet, so you need to go back and do that. The last step is to work with your charcoal pencil and your Q-tip that came in your supply kit at the beginning. Some of these areas require just a little bit of that medium tone shaded in, so we're going to use our charcoal pencil and we're going to lay it out in just a very small little line up against the space where we want to have the shadow show up. And once we've added that line, we're going to go back over it with our Q-tip to help it blend out. To avoid continuously breaking your Q-tip, I would recommend placing your pointer finger on the back of the fluffy side of the Q-tip rather than on the stick so that you don't end up snapping it. And as you continue to shade these spaces, it's important to try to pull that value out into the white space until it just stops and is a nice smooth transition. Make sure you use that Q-tip to get all the way up against the edge so that you don't have a light value before you get to your medium tones. And once you complete this step and add all of your medium tone shadows with your charcoal pencil, then you are finished. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Zengem series. I hope that you enjoyed going through step by step and completing that drawing together, but keep in mind that our next episode is going to be so much fun because you're doing that all on your own. And this next drawing will be based completely on your creativity and adding in those different zentangle patterns any way that you want to. So I will see you for our next episode soon. Thanks for watching.